Happy Sunday, everyone, and welcome to Unity of Kern County on this 7th day of February 2021. I'm Reverend Chuck, and today we're going to look at what it means to speak about God's will. Now, the materials I do share with you on my Sunday lessons are based upon spiritual principles taught by Jesus and Unity, as well as my 28 years as a Unity minister. And of course, as we do each Sunday, we open with the Charles Fillmore prayer, honoring that presence of God as we best understand that presence in our life as God's presence. And so we pray, I'm now in the presence of pure being and immersed in the Holy Spirit of life, love, and wisdom. I acknowledge your presence and power, O blessed Spirit. In your divine wisdom, now erase my mortal limitations, and from your pure substance of love, bring into manifestation my world according to your perfect law. And so it is. Well, we all grew up in our respective religions, learning about God's will. But what is God's will? You know, Jesus is quoted as saying that thy will be done, as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. And many of us have also prayed when we found our lives and times in trouble, or we found ourselves in anguish and we didn't know what to do, so we just put our lives into God's hands, as they say. Well, author Sharon Janis had this to say about the statement of "Thy will be done." She writes, "The theme song of surrender is Thy will be done." This statement can be analyzed in a couple of different angles, depending upon your understanding of actually how God's will works. Number one, from the duality point of view, thy will be done is an offering of submission, she says, and servitude. There is little you and a big God, and you agree to do whatever the big God says you're going to do, whether you want to do it or not. Well, that's the one I grew up with, okay? God was always looking. He had his little black book, and he knew everything, heard everything, wrote everything down. And God forbid, and Judgment Day, he opened that book, and there were too many black marks. Well, you weren't going to go into heaven. That was the God's will that I grew up with. Then the other one is the view of oneness. The second way to interpret this line involves, of course, a deeper and more esoteric meaning. She writes, "Here, thy will be done isn't so much a surrender or intention as a declaration of fact, an assertion of the unity of all creation. Thy will be done means that even if I try really, really hard not to do God's will, his will is nevertheless still done, in spite of my intentions. As one poet wrote," she writes, "not even a leaf moves without his will." Well, when I read that, that got me to thinking. And so, not even a leaf moves without his will? Well, what causes a leaf to move? The wind, of course. And simply stated, the wind is movement of air caused by unseen heating of the earth by the sun. It does not have much substance, and you can't see it or hold it, but you can sure tell when that wind is blowing. You can feel the force of that wind against you. Well, we can't see or hold God, but we can feel God's presence in our lives and through the natural laws that were created, that are part of creation. So in a way, the poet was right when he said that the leaf responds to the wind, which is part of natural law, which was created, after all, by God. So therefore, the leaf moves by the will of God. Something to think about. Anyways, Jesus' understanding of God's will for us can be found in the foundation of his ministry to the people. And that foundation, of course, consists of faith and forgiveness, compassion, and love. And none of his teachings ever express God's will as being punitive or destructive. That never happened. He never taught or said that the Romans were there as a punishment for the Jews for their lack of faith in God. That had nothing to do with it. Jesus' God was not a God of destruction. There were no earthquakes, floods, or famines, or disease that he attributed to God's will. They were all natural laws, causes based upon climate, Earth's natural movement, and of course the lack of proper hygiene and understanding about how germs, are passed around. People got sick, plagues happened. It was all part of the natural process. When Jesus taught the disciples to pray, he said, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So when I looked at that opening statement, there are only 24 words here. It spelled out for me anyways, a very simple understanding of God's will as Jesus understood it. Our Father. It starts off, not my Father, but our Father. Our Father, meaning that God, in Jesus' mind, was the God for everybody. It didn't matter who you were. God was our Father. Who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. God's dominion, God's kingdom, where love and beauty and order, harmony, forgiveness, compassion, abundant blessings, peace, and understanding reign supreme in the kingdom. The Holy of Holies, where the Lord of our being, the Lord of all, resides. Well, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, that means that God's kingdom of all good is Jesus' statement that God's will is to be expressed and experienced on earth as it already is in heaven. So all the good is already there. We're just asking for it to be expressed. Well, how is that going to be expressed? Well, it has to be expressed through us. For God's will is spiritual. It resides in the realm of spirit. As Jesus stated, God is spirit, and we must worship God in spirit and truth. We are told that God gave humankind dominion over all earthly things, and then he put his law within us. That law meaning love always works in our hearts. When we love one another as Jesus so instructed, we are doing God's will because it is the law that has been placed inside of us. God also gave us the capacity to think, to discern, to co-create. So he willed his sons and daughters to do just that by giving them the ability to live a life under his law, the law of love, or we can choose to be willful and deny all things good under that law. So if you've ever wondered where that idea of God's will being something punitive or destructive came from, it can be found in the origins of humankind's willfulness of blaming God for all that ever happened. Blaming God for the floods and the famine, for the disease and death, and of course destruction. That can be found throughout the Old Testament. But Jesus never taught that. Instead of accepting our responsibility of willingly living under law, love always working, humankind chose to say instead, "No, it's not my fault. It must be God's will when bad things happen." And all we need do is look at our own lives, look at the happenings around us, even in today's time. Who of us have not heard religious leaders tell their followers that it was God's will that this accident or this disaster or this disease or even this war or this situation or this problem or a number of other reasons happen in order to punish a person or a group of people? Jesus never taught that idea or concept of God because in Jesus' mind, God was a loving God, only wanting the highest and best for his beloved children. All they had to do is align their will with God's will, our free will, to choose which is good, based upon the law of love always working, or the opposite. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. In other words, it is God's will that we have all the good we could ever want or ever desire. Now, I'm going to share a little personal story of my own life about God's will. And of course, I had gotten out of the Army and had started my life and all that. And in 1983, my father had passed away. Well, he chose to be cremated so that could be interned with his mother. Well, being Catholic, all right, we requested that a funeral mass be said. And of course, the priest and I met in the Narthex, and I knew Father Cronin because he was my priest growing up. He baptized me, First Communion, conferred confirmation upon me. He was our family priest for our parish. Well, we met in the Narthex, and I wanted to bring my father's ashes in and place them on a little memorial table, and he refused. So we got into a debate over God's will. And I asked him plainly, I said, Father, I'm a Vietnam vet. I saw death, I saw destruction. So I have an answer or a question for you. What about my fellow veterans who were blown to bits, no body parts to be found, or those that were killed by a blast or by fire from napalm being dropped, and their bodies incinerated? What about them? And he told me this. Well, that was God's will. Your father, however, sinned because he chose to be cremated, and that is against the Catholic Church doctrine. Well, needless to say, that was the last time I ever set foot in a Catholic church as a Catholic. I knew right then and there that didn't matter whether Vatican II had taken place couple decades earlier. Father Cronin and many like him were still part of that old concept, that old belief system, that it was God's will. And we weren't to challenge it. We weren't to debate it. And so my father was denied that request. Needless to say, the Vietnam War did change my concept of God's will dramatically, especially when I started to think about the special dispensation we were given, the blessing we were given by the Catholic priest, so that we could kill other human beings. That was God's will for us to do so. Well, couldn't buy it anymore. Can't buy it. Can't buy the idea of just war. And that's another issue, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Just needless to say that my idea since my childhood about God's will has more or less been upgraded, so to speak, to Jesus's understanding of God's will. And that is with a loving, compassionate, forgiving God that does not will death or destruction on any of his children. So this is what I created for myself. It's an acronym. I love acronyms because it helps you remember things and it's easier to recall. So this is what I created for myself. God's will is this: God's omnipotent, divine spirit wills individualized love and life. God's omnipotent, divine spirit wills individualized love and life. That's Jesus' God, and that's Jesus' God's understanding of God's will. So I'm going to leave you with one more thought about God's will for us. And think about this lesson that was taught by Jesus, and it's found in Mark 5:45, in which he states, and I quote, "Your Father makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends the rain on the just and the unjust." For me, that means God's will is absolute good, regardless of what we do with it. So join me next week when we take a look at what it means and why that statement was so important for Jesus to make, why that point was so important to the people to know and to understand. Well, friends, at any time, if you have questions about any of the material that I've discussed here, please feel free to contact me on Facebook, through Messenger, or through my email at revchuckunity@yahoo.com. That's revchuckunity@yahoo.com. And of course, I want to thank all of you who follow me on Facebook or YouTube, and the financial support that keeps Unity of Kern County open and accessible to all those that enjoy the messages. So until next week, remember to be good to yourself and others. God bless you, dear friends.